What happens when the most powerful military machine on Earth suddenly runs out of options? Right now, across three continents, a war that everyone was told would stay contained is exploding into something no one predicted. Before we go further, if you want to understand what is really happening in the Middle East, hit that subscribe button right now. Tap like if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines, and share this with someone who still thinks this war is under control, because it is not. For months, the world was told this conflict was manageable. Officials in Washington kept repeating the same soft, reassuring words. Strikes were described as limited. Retaliation was called measured. Every escalation was quietly rebranded as a controlled response, but something changed almost overnight. Iran did something it had not done in this exact way before. It struck a military airbase inside Jordan, a country that has spent decades trying to stay out of the direct line of fire. According to Iranian statements, the target was a group of advanced fighter jets sitting on that base. And according to Thiron, several of them never took off again. At nearly the same moment, oil tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz were suddenly warned, then hit and reportedly stopped in the water. American officials pushed back immediately. They said every incoming missile was intercepted. Not one got through, but video evidence that surfaced afterward told a different story, one that did not match the official denial. This is the pattern we keep seeing throughout this war. One side says everything is fine, the other side shows footage that says otherwise, and somewhere in between those two claims is a truth that neither side wants to fully admit. Why would Iran suddenly strike a base inside Jordan, a country not even directly involved in the fighting? According to sources close to regional intelligence circles, the timing was not random. It came right after a private meeting between American and Israeli leadership. A meeting where, according to these same sources, plans for a new operation against Iran were being finalized. If that is true, then this strike on Jordan was not aggression for the sake of aggression. It was a warning shot aimed at stopping something before it could start. And it did not stop there. While the world was still processing that strike, another front clear's throat opened up. In Iraq, a coordinated set of strikes carried out by American and Saudi forces killed roughly 20 fighters from state-aligned popular mobilization forces. This was not a militia operating outside the government. This was a force with formal ties to Iraq's own state. Think about what that means. When you strike a group that is legally connected to a sovereign government, you're not just hitting a target. You're opening a new front in a war that country did not choose to join. At the same time, Saudi Arabia was pointing fingers of its own, blaming Iraqi resistance groups for attacks on its oil facilities. And in the middle of all this confusion, reports surfaced that 4 or possibly 5 members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard were killed in those same American and Saudi strikes. So within the space of about 24 hours, we went from a fragile, uneasy calm to missile strikes, tanker attacks, crossbar bombing, and dead soldiers from multiple nations. How did we get here so fast? To understand that, you need to rewind a little and look at how this war actually grew, because it did not start as one giant explosion. It started small and it kept multiplying. It began with Saudi Arabia deciding to open up fighting on Yemen, targeting the Houthi movement known formerly as Ansar. That decision alone might have stayed contained, but the Houthis responded hard. They tightened their blockade on Saudi shipping and struck one of the most advanced oil refineries in the region, causing serious damage. Saudi Arabia responded again, using proxy forces to hit back at Yemen. And once more, the Houthis answered by striking a second refinery, this time in the eastern part of Saudi territory. Here's where things get strange. Saudi Arabia blamed that second attack not on the Houthis, but on Iraq. And that accusation, whether accurate or not, became the excuse for American and Saudi forces to strike inside Iraq the very next day. This is how modern wars spread. Not through one massive declaration, but through a chain reaction of blame, retaliation, and miscalculation, each link pulling in another country that never wanted to be part of the fight. Now, Iraq has been pulled in, and Iraq is not small. When you compare raw manpower, Iraq dwarfs Saudi Arabia. Iran dwarfs Saudi Arabia. Even the Houthi movement alone may be roughly equal in strength or possibly larger. Saudi Arabia has about 20 million citizens. That is the size of the population it is now facing off against, spread across multiple hostile fronts, all while its own military resources remain limited. Analysts studying this conflict point out something that should worry anyone paying attention. Expanding a war when your resources are already stretched thin is one of the oldest mistakes in military history. Yet that is exactly what appears to be happening here. There's also a quieter, more human detail buried inside this story. Many expect Iraqi retaliation to be delayed, not because of weakness, but out of respect. A major religious pilgrimage, the Arbaeen, is happening right now, and millions of pilgrims are traveling through the region. No one wants to turn that sacred journey into another target zone. So while the world watches for the next strike, there is a pause, not because the anger is faded, but because human decency has not completely disappeared, even in war. Then there is the mystery of Iran's sudden strike itself. Officials in Washington could not even agree on how many missiles were fired. Some say 5, some say 6, but all of them insisted every single one was intercepted. If that is true, ask yourself this: why does footage appear to show real impact? Why would Iran publicly claim a successful strike on American fighter jets if nothing actually happened? There is a theory worth considering. Iran may have anticipated a fresh round of American strikes and decided to move first, striking a jet capability that could have been used against it before it could be used at all. If that theory is correct, then what looked like an unprovoked act of aggression was actually a calculated, defensive maneuver aimed at reducing future threats before they could materialize. And despite optimistic talk over the weekend about diplomacy getting back on track, despite mediation efforts from regional powers trying to calm things down, the truth on the ground says otherwise. Iran's position has reportedly remained firm before any negotiation on nuclear issues can even be discussed. Iran wants foreign forces out of southern Lebanon. It wants the blockade lifted. It wants sanctions removed. It wants frozen assets released immediately, not promised for some future date. The American position is the exact opposite. Nuclear discussions first, everything else later. Two immovable positions sitting directly across from each other with no visible bridge between them. If you are starting to see how fragile this entire situation really is, make sure you are subscribed, because what comes next in this story is even more unsettling and you do not want to miss it. Let's talk about what just happened near Egypt, because it adds yet another layer to this expanding crisis. An American fuel tanker carrying liquefied natural gas was struck by a drone at a port in Egypt. This happened in broad daylight in the early afternoon. Leadership in Washington confirmed they were briefed on it almost immediately, and just like before, blame was quickly pointed toward Iran, even though at the time there was no confirmed evidence identifying who actually launched that drone. This is one of the most dangerous patterns in modern warfare. Attribution happens faster than verification. Someone gets blamed before anyone actually knows the truth. And once that blame is public, it becomes almost impossible to walk back, even if the facts later say something different. Following that attack, strong promises of retaliation followed. Leadership vowed that new strikes were coming, describing an intention to hit back hard, framing it as simply taking a turn, as if this deadly exchange were some kind of game where sides trade blows back and forth. But here is the problem with that mentality. War is not a game with equal turns. It is a system where every strike costs real money, real equipment, and often real lives. Consider the simple math. If 5 missiles were fired and all 5 were supposedly intercepted, that means at least 10 defensive missiles were used to stop them, sometimes more, because defense systems often fire 2 interceptors per incoming threat just to be safe. Each of those interceptor missiles costs several $1,000,000. Do that math across an entire war and you start to see something officials rarely say out loud. This is not just a war of soldiers and territory, it is a war of budgets, and one side is burning through resources at a pace it cannot sustain forever. Meanwhile, Iran appears to be playing a very different, much quieter game. Rather than simply trading missile for missile, reports suggest Iran has spent the last several months systematically destroying radar systems and satellite communication capabilities used to track its movements. Nearly 20 such systems, according to some assessments, have already been taken out. Think about what that actually means. It is not just about blowing things up. It is about blinding an opponent, removing its ability to see incoming threats before they arrive. Even officials on the American side have quietly admitted that early warning radar capability, something they used to rely on heavily, is no longer functioning the way it once did. At the same time, American forces appear to be shifting away from some of their traditional bases in the region, moving personnel and aircraft to alternate locations outside places long considered secure strongholds. Why would that be happening if everything were truly under control? There's also a political ripple effect happening inside Jordan itself. As pressure builds, a large group of political, military, and economic leaders reportedly published an open letter directly addressing the country's leadership, essentially demanding that foreign military presence be removed from Jordanian soil. This is bigger than one letter. It reflects a growing sentiment across the region, a quiet but powerful message that foreign military presence is no longer welcome. Not in Jordan, not in Iraq, not really anywhere except the one place still willing to host it without hesitation. There was also a strange moment tied to a funeral of all things. During a gathering meant to honor a fallen political figure, a private meeting reportedly took place. Shortly afterward, Ukraine's foreign ministry reached out directly to Iranian officials, essentially apologizing for a previous incident involving an attack in the Caspian Sea, describing it as a mistake, not an intentional escalation. Why would that matter? Because it suggests that behind closed doors there is real fear of this conflict growing even wider than it already is. Fear strong enough that a completely different country involved in a completely different war felt the need to step back and de-escalate immediately. and the financial markets are already reacting to all of this. Just as optimism briefly returned and stock values started climbing, renewed threats of war sent everything crashing back down. In a single day, major stock indexes dropped by hundreds of points. Meanwhile, oil prices, which had briefly cooled off, spiked back above $90 a barrel. This is the real cost of uncertainty. It is not abstract. It shows up in fuel prices at the pump and retirement accounts, and the price of everyday goods that depend on transportation and energy. Ordinary people, thousands of miles away from any battlefield, are already feeling the financial weight of this conflict. There's also growing talk about shipping fees near a critical waterway used by countless vessels every single day. If armed groups begin charging tolls or restricting passage through these routes, global trade could face serious disruption almost overnight. And that brings us to something even more important than missiles and airstrikes. Some experts believe this region, more specifically the passage connecting the Red Sea to the wider ocean, has quietly become more strategically important than the traditional oil corridors everyone has focused on for decades. If that passage becomes unreliable, ships are forced to take alternate routes, sometimes traveling all the way around the southern tip of Africa. According to strategic assessments studying exactly this scenario, that detour can increase shipping costs by as much as double, sometimes more depending on the destination. This is not just a regional issue, it becomes a global economic issue. That is exactly why so many major military and commercial organizations, shipping regulators, insurance companies, humanitarian groups, and government defense agencies from multiple continents have all quietly agreed on one unsettling conclusion. The center of strategic competition is shifting away from older traditional flashpoints toward this narrower, more fragile passage. And there's a much bigger picture hiding behind all of this chaos, something most people never even think about. For centuries, global trade has depended overwhelmingly on the ocean, on ships moving goods from one side of the world to another. But slowly, a new kind of infrastructure is being built, one based on massive overland railway and highway networks stretching across entire continents. If that shift continues, the nations controlling those land routes gain enormous power. Power that does not depend on controlling the seas at all. This single shift could quietly redefine global trade for the next century, moving influence away from traditional naval powers and toward countries with strong internal transportation networks instead. And whether intentionally or not, every missile fired, every tanker stopped, every shipping lane disrupted in this current war is accelerating that exact transition. If this is starting to feel bigger than a simple regional conflict, that is because it is. Drop a comment right now with one word describing how this makes you feel, because I want to know if I'm the only one who finds this terrifying. Now let's talk about something even more revealing, something that exposes just how strained military resources have become on one side of this war. During earlier phases of this conflict, a large number of strikes were not carried out using the most advanced, most precise weapons available. Instead, many attacks relied on simpler guided bombs, essentially older explosives fitted with cheap guidance kits that allow them to glide toward a target instead of falling straight down. These weapons have a limited range, roughly 40 kilometers at best. That is a critical detail because it explains something important. Most of these strikes have been happening near coastlines, not deep inside enemy territory, not because that is strategically ideal, but because that is as far as these weapons can actually reach. Compare that to some of the long-range guided bombs used by opposing forces elsewhere in the world, weapons capable of traveling well over 100 miles with a much heavier payload. The difference in capability is massive, and it says something uncomfortable about the true state of military readiness on the American side of this conflict. There is also reportedly internal tension building at the highest levels of military leadership. Sources describe a growing disagreement between senior commanders overseeing regional operations and top military leadership responsible for global strategy. One side reportedly believes operations can continue indefinitely without serious consequences. The other side, responsible for maintaining readiness across every other region in the world, understands a harsh truth. Every missile fired here is a missile that will not be available if a completely different crisis erupts somewhere else on the planet. This is the quiet, unglamorous reality of modern warfare. You cannot fight forever without eventually running short on the tools required to keep fighting, and that shortage is becoming increasingly visible. According to intelligence estimates shared by knowledgeable sources, since this specific phase of the conflict escalated, Iran alone has reportedly launched somewhere around 9,000 missiles and drones toward opposing military assets. 9,000. Before this latest escalation began, many analysts confidently claimed Iran's stockpiles were nearly depleted after earlier rounds of intense fighting. Yet the numbers tell a different story, one of continued capability rather than exhaustion. Part of the explanation may lie in something surprisingly practical. Rather than only building brand new missiles from scratch, reports suggest Iran has been refurbishing older models, extending their usable life, and stretching existing resources much further than expected. There's also the issue of visibility. Iran's missile production and storage infrastructure is largely built underground, hidden from satellite surveillance and difficult to infiltrate with human intelligence. According to sources with intelligence community connections, even now current estimates suggest around 60% of Iran's original missile stockpile remains operational and usable. If that estimate is accurate, it means the assumption that Iran was running out of firepower may have been dangerously wrong from the very beginning, and this underground infrastructure is not limited to missiles alone. Reports describe extensive systems involving drones, naval mines, and small attack vessels, all built and maintained largely out of sight, all supported by a domestic supply chain reportedly strong enough to continue production despite years of pressure and sanctions. This raises a deeply uncomfortable question for anyone hoping this war ends quickly. If one side can continue manufacturing weapons faster than they are being destroyed, how exactly does this conflict reach a natural conclusion? There's also serious concern about Israel's position throughout all of this. Reports indicate that Israeli air defense capacity has become significantly depleted after repeated waves of attacks. Even more concerning, damage has reportedly been done to critical refining infrastructure, Clear's throat, responsible for producing diesel and aviation fuel resources essential for both civilian life and continued military operations. If Iran were to launch a renewed concentrated attack specifically targeting Israel, some analysts suggest there may be very limited capability left to stop it. And unlike previous rounds of damage, some of this destruction may not be quickly repayable and could represent long-term lasting harm to critical infrastructure. This is exactly why, according to insider accounts, there's been a quiet effort to minimize public attention on Israel's direct involvement in recent strikes. Officials reportedly want to avoid drawing focus toward vulnerabilities that adversaries could exploit even further, but hiding vulnerability does not eliminate it. It only delays the moment when that vulnerability becomes impossible to ignore. At this point, ask yourself something honestly. If both major military powers involved in this conflict are quietly running low on defenses, resources, and sustainable options, what does that actually mean for how this war ends? Some analysts believe the most likely outcome is not victory for either side, but sheer economic exhaustion. Without stable access to the region's oil resources, particularly the specific type of heavy sulfur-rich crude oil that only a handful of refineries around the world are actually built to process, fuel shortages will continue tightening across major economies in Asia, Europe, and beyond. This is not something that can simply be replaced with a different type of oil from somewhere else. The infrastructure needed to process that specific crude only exists in a few key regions, and every one of them is now affected in some way by this expanding conflict. Eventually, according to this theory, continuing the war becomes economically unsustainable long before it becomes militarily unwinnable. If that is true, then the real force ending this war might not be a peace treaty or military defeat. It might simply be the moment when continuing to fight costs more than any government or economy can realistically absorb. There is something deeply human buried inside all of this analysis, something easy to lose amid statistics about missiles and stock markets. Real people are living inside this uncertainty right now. Families are watching oil prices climb and wondering if they can afford to heat their homes. Workers are watching stock markets swing wildly and worrying about their retirement savings. Entire communities near ports, refineries, and shipping lanes are living with the very real fear that their region could become the next unexpected target. This war is not happening in some distant abstract space disconnected from ordinary life. It is already reaching into grocery store prices, fuel costs, and financial stability for millions of people who never asked to be part of any of this. And that is exactly why understanding what is really happening matters so much. Not to feel afraid, but to feel informed. Because informed people make better decisions, ask better questions, and refuse to accept simple explanations for deeply complicated problems. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about understanding the full picture, not just the headlines. Do me a favor and hit that like button right now because it genuinely helps this kind of deeper analysis reach more people who need to see it. So, where does all of this actually lead? There is a repeating pattern worth paying close attention to. Historically, whenever military pressure builds against certain factions in this region, there tends to be a sudden, unexpected announcement of progress toward peace. Confident claims emerge that negotiations are close, that the other side is exhausted and ready to talk, that resolution is just around the corner, and then almost predictably fighting resumes. Anyway, some analysts strongly suspect the same pattern will repeat here. Optimistic statements may return. Talk of imminent negotiations may resurface. But underneath that surface-level optimism, the fundamental disagreements, foreign troop withdrawal, lifted sanctions, unfrozen assets versus nuclear program restrictions, remain completely unresolved. There's also a harder truth worth confronting honestly. The longer this war continues, the more fronts that open up around it, the fewer realistic paths toward de-escalation actually remain. Every additional strike, every additional country pulled into the fighting makes stepping back politically and strategically more difficult. From a purely strategic standpoint, continued conflict and instability can sometimes serve certain interests better than peace ever could. That is an uncomfortable thought, but it is one worth sitting with honestly rather than dismissing outright. But here's the critical piece. So many people overlook continuing a war requires resources. It requires functioning supply chains, financial stability, public support, and sustainable military capability. And every piece of evidence we have examined throughout this story points towards serious strain across nearly all of those categories. On one side in particular, military history has shown again and again that raw power alone cannot compensate for exhausted logistics. You can have the most advanced weapons in the world, but if you cannot sustain their use, replace what is destroyed, and support ongoing operations, that advanced technology eventually stops mattering. There is a particularly striking historical comparison worth mentioning here. Decades ago, an American aircraft carrier sailed directly through the same strategic waterway, now considered too dangerous to approach, docking safely without hesitation. Today, that same level of confidence simply does not exist. Major naval assets are being kept at a cautious distance, a quiet but powerful signal of how dramatically the balance of deterrence has shifted. At the same time, active duty ground force numbers remain far smaller than historical wartime deployments from previous major conflicts in the same region, raising serious questions about whether large-scale ground operations are even realistically possible anymore. When you combine limited ground forces, strained naval confidence, and stretched precision weapon stockpiles, you start to see a military structure that was designed for a different era, now facing a completely different kind of prolonged multi-front conflict. It may not be fully equipped to sustain. And here is perhaps the most important realization buried inside this entire story. For decades, global military dominance rested on the assumption that no other force could seriously challenge it. That assumption is now being tested in real time, not through some dramatic single battle, but through a slow, grinding war of attrition across multiple fronts simultaneously. Every stalled negotiation, every unexpected strike, every strained supply line chips away at that old assumption a little more. This raises a haunting question worth sitting with. If the most powerful military infrastructure in modern history is struggling to sustain a war against opponents once considered far weaker, what does that reveal about the true balance of global power today? Maybe raw strength was never really about the size of an arsenal. Maybe it was always about endurance, about who can keep going the longest when the fighting gets hard, expensive, and exhausting. Right now, based on nearly every piece of evidence coming out of this rapidly escalating war, one side appears to be running out of that endurance far faster than anyone in power ever expected. And that single shift, quiet, unglamorous, buried inside spreadsheets of missile costs and fuel shortages, may end up mattering more than any single battlefield victory or defeat. Wars are rarely won by the side with the loudest threats. They are decided slowly and painfully by the side that can keep functioning long after the other side runs out of options. If this conflict continues on its current path, the real turning point may not come from a dramatic military breakthrough at all. It may come quietly in a boardroom, in a budget review, in a moment when someone finally admits there simply is not enough left to keep going. And when that moment arrives, the entire balance of power in this region and possibly far beyond it could shift in ways the world is not yet prepared to understand. If this breakdown helped you finally understand what is really happening in this rapidly spreading conflict, make sure you are subscribed because this story is nowhere near finished. And when the next major shift happens, you will want to be here to understand exactly what it means.